Yo guys, what's up? James here, and I just wanted to quickly remind you that each episode of the Crunchy Take is available on Spotify, YouTube, Radio Public, and Google Podcasts. So if you'd like to hear these episodes as soon as they air, please consider following or subscribing on the platform of your choice. I can also be found by typing in James Kittapole on Facebook or james.kittapole for Instagram. If you'd like to recommend topics for me or my guests to cover, the best way to do so would be to either send an email to crunchymedicine@gmail.com or send us a voice message at anchor.fm/james-kittapole/message. That's anchor.fm/james-kittapole. That's KITTIPOL/message. Thanks for stopping by and enjoy the podcast. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another round of the Crunchy Take, and we're in for a special episode today on a pretty interesting topic, at least for me. But without further ado, Joseph Mosse, how's it going, my brother?
Hey, doing well. It's good to be here.
Joseph, can you bring whoever is listening up to speed? Who are you, and where do you come from? And what do you currently do? What is your current occupation?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm a TCK, or third culture kid. I was born in the U.S., but grew up in Ukraine, part of the time in the city of Kiev and the rest of the time down south in Odessa. I've been back in the States for, since 2014. So that's 6 years now. Right now, I teach high school social studies, and I teach at a small private Christian school called Horizon Christian School. I do world history, U.S. history, government, econ. I got to teach a Russian history class this last semester, which was pretty fun. So yeah, that's kind of what I do right now.
Did you for context, just to not make it super awkward. We went to college together. Joseph came in when I was a sophomore. 2014.
Yep, that's right.
About the year. Had you been to the States before?
I had been. We'd visited. We'd come back a couple of times. My family were missionaries, so you do home service and go back and forth every now and again.
Can you kind of explain what that? The trigger question for any TCK or MK student is, where are you from? Mm-hmm. Is because it's like, and for me, it's almost the same thing. Is because as an international student, and especially if you have dual citizenship like you do, it's almost like, where do I truly belong? Can you kind of take us into the mindset of a missionary kid? Like, what's it like to sort of juggle these two really strong identities?
I mean, it definitely is confusing at times or frustrating. Never really feeling like you have a concrete home or a culture that you fully identify with. But at the same time, there's a lot of benefits because you can draw on aspects of both of the cultures that you grew up with or that you're familiar with, and kind of pick and choose. You get a little bit of that objectivity of an outsider, maybe, but you get a little bit more of that insider perspective than you would have one way or another.
Yeah.
It's a complicated experience. There's a lot that you could talk about, but that's kind of a surface level, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah. Any kind of, for a lot of people, this is an area that they just don't know about. A lot of people who grew up, who we went to college with, there was a surprising number of people that never even left the country, that have either never left the country, never even left their state, never left their region, I suppose, but it is the world we live in. That's not a bad thing at all. It's just circumstantial. It's the way people were brought up. Did you, so coming to college, was it your first time being in the States for a long period of time?
Yeah, that was the first time when I came to college. The first time I had been in the States for, more than 1 year since I was 7.
Do you think that your prior knowledge of America prior to studying and maybe setting your career down here was different than what it is now, or has it pretty much remained the same?
I would definitely say that I've learned a lot and sort of learned to adjust to American culture, and kind of how to function and how people think around here. I think definitely after being here for 6 years, you definitely do learn a little bit more about how to what is going on in the United States. There's a lot that I didn't know coming in that I sort of became more aware of as time went on here.
The reason I wanted to ask you to come on, I mean, dude, I feel like this has been, it's been like a year and a half process to try to, because I think about a year ago, I broached the topic, hey man, if I were to ever start a podcast, would you ever be interested in being on? And so you kind of gave me this, well, we'll see, situational wise and whatnot. And it's just crazy that a year and a half later, everything that's been going on, here we are, and quite possibly the main reason, I mean, this series just provided kind of the perfect backdrop to have not only someone of your background come on, but of your expertise.
I wouldn't consider myself like a bona fide expert or anything like that, but I've always, as far back as I can think or remember, I've always been kind of an obsessive person. If something was interesting to me, I would be like all about that.
What were some of the first things you were obsessed about?
Very first thing that I can remember was trains. Like my parents would take me to the train station. I just wanted to watch those trains come and go.
Did you ever collect them?
I did. I did that. I had a lot of these little, Thomas the Train Engine toys and stuff. Then pretty quickly I moved on to dinosaurs, which was a pretty all-encompassing one. Dinosaurs are what motivated me to learn to read, so I could read the dinosaur books on my own.
How early did you learn about the word paleontology?
Pretty early.
In kindergarten. Somehow it got ingrained into my head in kindergarten. Because my teacher was like, this is how you spell it. This is what they do. And we're going to dig up, they would bring in, when I was in kindergarten, I went to an international school that had an American curriculum. And the teacher brought in this like kind of kit where I don't know if it's like a faux kind of clay / sediment, and you knack at it with like a small little mini hammer, and there'd be bones underneath, and you brush it away with a brush or whatnot. Do you ever collect those, I don't even know what you call them, fossil toys where you have to do the work yourself and like?
I've definitely had a few of those things, or like the wooden skeleton model that you kind of put together. I would go to the library with my grandmother and Xerox pages of dinosaur books to take back with me and stuff like that. But not too long after that is essentially the same sort of thing. I started to become more interested in sort of history, stories of the past, ancient civilizations, and that one has really stuck with me. Honestly, since I was 7 or 8.
Ancient civilizations.
Initially things with swords and shields and, ancient Greeks. I had a lot of really cool sort of children's history books that were very engaging, that kind of pulled me into it. So there was just a lot of interest early on, and that's been fairly consistent.
Did any movies come in the way of that came and kind of aided you, or books or picture books, comics?
There was a book called The Children's History of the World, which was one of my first. I read through that thing a couple of times. One was playing the game Age of Empires, actually, or Age of Empires 2 to be specific. There was, let's see, what else? There was a large assortment of different books and things that kind of pulled me in that direction, I think, or at least helped me feed that interest.
Video games?
Well, let's see. Besides Age of Empires, that was really my main one, like history game that I played throughout most of my childhood. Later on, when I was older, I also got into the Total War series of games, which are kind of like the same idea, just better graphics and stuff.
Well, besides what we're about to talk about today, and we're going to get your opinion on that in just a second here, what are some of your favorites as far as for people wanting to know maybe a little more about recent history? What are some of your favorite movies that you'd recommend just right off the bat?
Favorite movies?
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, my all-time favorite movie is a movie called 12. It's a Russian-made movie by a director named Nikita Mikhalkov. It's sort of a modern Russian take on the play 12 Angry Men.
It's a brilliant movie.
Have you seen it? Did I show
you were the one that showed it to us.
Yeah,
you sat us down. Yeah. We were debating. This was a typical Friday night or whatnot. We went to Denny's. We went to Sean Denny's house. Shout out to Sean Denny. But yeah, you sat us down. Is their take on 12 Angry Men?
Yeah. So it kind of takes, the play is set in the United States. It takes that similar idea of, a young boy or young man accused of murder, in a seemingly obvious case. Most of the jurors kind of go in with their mindset, and one juror is not convinced, and the argument sort of goes on. It takes that basic storyline and transplants it into sort of Russia of the 2000s. And it's very, very interesting how that same story changes in a Russian context. And it takes, I mean, the original play also deals with, issues of discrimination in the court system, in the United States at the time. It takes those and transplants it to Russia. So for instance, in the Russian context, the boy is Chechnyan, and it gets into some of the issues surrounding the Chechen war. And also sort of the legacy of the Soviet Union and how people are dealing with it, and sort of through the jurors, it gives kind of a cross section of sort of maybe archetypes or maybe stereotypes of like different people, different classes in modern day Russia. It's also just a very beautiful movie, very interesting cinematography. I never thought that a sort of rundown school gym.
Oh no, it provides for those that don't know what we're referring to is a scene. Well, the whole movie, I'd like to say that the key events of the movie take place in a tiny gym that these people hold their jurors meeting in. Whereas, it would otherwise the American version or the original version is like in a small little office or whatnot. But they use this gym to like represent all different facets of their lives, the people around around the tables or whatnot. And they, obviously when people argue with each other, they pace back and forth. They use the gym as like various illustrations of their lives. It's 12. And who's the director?
Nikita Mikhalkov.
What else has he directed?
He's actually directed a lot of stuff. Some other interesting ones is a movie called The Barber of Siberia, which is sort of a almost an allegorical story about the relationship between Russia and the West. The story kind of revolves around this American woman who shows up in Russia right around the turn of the 20th century, sort of like the late era of the Romanov czars, and she meets a Russian officer cadet, and things happen and ensue. And I mean, there's this guy's
a very interesting character developer, man. Just his characters in his movies seem to really carry a certain type of energy. What year did 12 come out, just for our viewers?
What year did it come out? I'm not certain exactly when it came out. Maybe 2000.
I'd say it looks like mid 2000s.
Yeah, it's like in that era. The 2000s for sure. Well,
with that kind of introduction into Russian, well, not even Russian cinema, because what we're about to discuss is not Russian cinema. What we are here to discuss today is HBO's series titled Chernobyl, written by Craig Mazin. Same writer of the Hangover movies, believe it or not. This guy's been all over the place as far as writing wise, and he recently, I don't know if you know about the Last of Us video games. But supposedly he's been tagged as a writer for a series that HBO is going to produce with Naughty Dog.
Oh, really?
And he's been in talks as the writer. So yeah, whatever he did in Chernobyl, it's working. Because to go from such a tonal shift, Hangover movies, really party heavy, to really serious subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, at least he's not, typecast or sort of stuck.
No, not at all. It's hard. And even the soundtrack, the lady who did the soundtrack, Hildur, whose last name I'm not going to try to replicate. It's a very long Nordic name. She's received a lot of critical acclaim as well. Okay, but Chernobyl is HBO's kind of take on, I'd like to say, the mentality of what took place during that time period, right? It's a 5-part miniseries.
Yeah.
Right, 5 parts. Kind of like HBO's done historic miniseries before. They did the Pacific a while back. Did they do Brothers?
Band of Brothers? So, but I'm not confident on that one.
Yeah. But this was the first one to really not include gore to that extent. There was no shooting, there was no violence. It was more so, there was gore to, we'll get to that in a little bit. But this was the first series that sort of caught wind last year. This was, for context, this was right after Game of Thrones had just aired. Mm-hmm. And if you know pop culture news at all, Game of Thrones, at least according to the fans, didn't do that well.
Yeah.
But seemingly out of nowhere, this miniseries about a certain time in history popped up out of nowhere, and it started winning a whole bunch of awards. So how did you first come to watch it?
Well, I mean, I had stumbled across trailers for it, I mean, in the spring before it came out, fairly early on. And it really caught my interest because, especially in Western media, it's not really all that often that you see a lot about Ukraine, and especially not a lot of stories or media or movies that like specifically tackle, Ukrainian, and I mean Chernobyl's not just Ukrainian, also Belarusian and Russian,
Minsk,
but it's in Ukraine. Not a lot of media that actually tackles Ukrainian stories. There's like a Jack Ryan movie where they go to Ukraine for part of it, and there's some stereotypical Ukrainians who show up. So I was really excited actually when I saw the trailers. It was cool to see that they were going to tell that story, and it would be more widely known in the West. I was a little concerned that it would be, historically inaccurate or sort of there'd be problems in its portrayal.
As always, when I saw the trailer, it was like you always have that gnawing suspicion that Hollywood or certain producers, certain media outlets are gonna hype up certain events, which this is why I wanted to bring you on, because Chernobyl feels different. They take liberties in and in different facets and different areas, but you see the trailers, and they 9 times out of 10 it doesn't give you a realistic picture of what's about to happen, basically because you can't spoil history.
That is true.
You can't. People, this might date the pod a little bit, but recently ESPN aired a 10-part series of their own titled The Last Dance. And it has to do with Michael Jordan. And it's funny that at the end of each episode, they leave a cliffhanger as if you don't know what happens next,
Well, actually, that's something interesting about Chernobyl, because you're right, to some extent, there's no spoiling it. And I think that the people, the directors and writers who made it, tackled that issue in a really interesting way. With if you've seen it, the explosion happens at the very beginning, and is really hardly given even any attention. It rushes to get over with the thing that most people know, which is Chernobyl exploded. Yeah. Right. But that's the thing, is for most people, that was the full extent of their knowledge. Right. In Ukraine, obviously, there's a lot more knowledge about what happened. In Russia there is, and in Belarus there is, or Belarusia, I guess is the English way of saying that. I don't know what it is actually. Not Belarus. Anyways, there's in the West, people don't know a lot about the details of what came after, like what were the specifics, why did it explode, and what were the consequences, and who were like the little people. So I think that in a really interesting way, and a really engaging way, the Chernobyl gets around the problem of you can't spoil history, because instead of pinning all their attention to is Chernobyl going to explode, in which case we'd all be like, yes, we all know that it exploded, right? It pins its tension onto the human emotional stories of the people who are caught up in the mess afterwards.
Yeah. The reason I sort of bring up the aspect of can't spoiling it, I'm always kind of leery of series and media depictions of historical events, especially if they're recent. I'm always, which is why when I first heard about it, I was kind of hesitant to watch it, because you always have to be aware that the people who were affected then are still, some of them are still alive. There's a good chunk of them that are still suffering from the events of Chernobyl, which now this is definitely going to date the podcast, but I really wanted to talk to you about it because in the face of what we're going through now, you can kind of, not to directly compare experiences, but Chernobyl in some sense is a series of events depicting these people who had to go through something unfathomably difficult. Unquestionably difficult. Sacrifices were made on many different ends. so that people barely know what it is today. The surface knowledge of what I came in with was the fact that, yes, it exploded, people died, and it's about ARS. It's about acute radiation syndrome or whatnot. It's just like, that's the surface knowledge of what people know. Unless you know world history like yourself, or if you paid attention in history class and you know remotely anything about the KGB or how they operated, or how different cultures operate in opposed to your own. Like, even for me, someone who is not from the United States, you study world history, it's like, damn, there's this whole different world that you don't understand. So I guess the proper way to go about it would be maybe really quickly skim through what happens from episode 1 to episode 5. So episode 1 is all about, Legasov, Valery Legasov. I'd say, would you say he's like the main character?
He's definitely one of the main ones. One of the interesting things about this, and I mean, nothing I'm saying is new. You can listen to the podcast the creators themselves made, and they'll lay this out too. But one of the interesting things about how the show is organized is that each episode covers a slightly longer period of time.
Right.
So like the first episode is focused on just the minutes and hours immediately after the explosion.
Correct.
The next episode is, the first couple of days, and then we get into, weeks and then months after the event. I don't remember the exact time scale that goes on there, but basically the first episode is focused on the immediate aftermath.
Right.
You see the firefighters going out to fight it initially. You see how little people knew about radiation at the time, and how so many people were exposed sort of out of ignorance or neglect to properly inform people about the dangers. And then, of course, the next several episodes pick up with the efforts to actually contain it. So Legasov shows up, Valery Legasov, at the end of the first episode, and then you see over the next couple of episodes how he and the Soviet commissioner, Buddy Sherbina, begin to actually tackle the problem. And sort of step by step, you see them trying to put the fire out, and then they have to deal with, the danger of the meltdown going down in deeper into the groundwaters or into a reservoir of water, causing an even larger explosion.
Can you kind of highlight that for a second? I feel like for people that did watch the show, or for people that didn't watch the show, so the Chernobyl power plant was this, it was right basically on top of this water pipe that was leading into the Black Sea. Is that what?
No. So saying? It was. So it's a nuclear power plant. So and this is more the science side of it, but like an integral part of the way that it worked was having an ample supply of water that could be heated, turned into steam, and then that is what turned the turbines to generate electricity. So there was a lot of water already there, and especially since after the explosion they left the water going, a lot of it had piled up in there. And also, so it's not that there was a pipe that led to the Black Sea; it's that it's in the northern part of Ukraine,
right?
And the Ukraine has a big river called the Dnieper River that sort of flows down it, and the problem was one of the problems was that the reactor, this radioactive material that's superheated, the graphite and stuff like that, it could melt through the floor essentially, and through the foundations of the building, and then get down into the actual earth itself. And if it gets deep enough, then it can start seeping into the groundwater. So the water that is below the ground that seeps into all of the streams and lakes and rivers, like in the
just
whole
contaminate
region.
your whole water supply.
that could,
and that's just the underground water supply. That's not taking into account the fallout rain that would have seeped up into the air or whatnot, and then the radioactive particles that would have been carried by wind across that whole continent. It's just what you're saying is so true. It's just they show you everything at the very beginning. They show you Legasov, the fact that he committed suicide. What, 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's 2 years after the event.
2 years, like to the day that the explosion happened, right? So we have Legasov, we have Sherbina, but we also have, I think I'll save that for later. in a little bit. We have the three main. I don't want to say villains because the movie this. I feel like there's this tendency to, I mean, in storytelling to say, oh, this is the protagonist, this is the antagonist, but these were at the end of the day, these were people trying to do their jobs. I was just trying to read into Brikhanov or whatnot. He was I think he was the lead or senior engineer at the Chernobyl power plant.
Yeah.
He got there at age 34.
Yeah.
And these were men that were very, very proud of their work. I mean, lack of knowledge in a ton of areas given. These were men that, when they got to when they got to the site, there was like nothing there, and they'd spent just a huge chunk of time building this thing. So by all accounts, do you think that Chernobyl was kind of the model place to be at the time, as far as nuclear energy and these kind of mini cities that existed in Russia?
I mean, in the Soviet Union at the time, the Chernobyl power plant was something that they were that the Soviet, the Communist Party as a whole was very, very proud of.
Did they have reason to be, in your opinion?
Oh, they saw it as just an example of, Soviet technological advancement. And, in a lot of ways it was. The town that was nearby where most of the workers lived, Pripyat, was sort of like the model Soviet utopia. It was a really nice place to live, especially compared to a lot of the Soviet Union. They had a beautiful public pool, beautifully designed streets, and really a lot of attention went into that specific area. People who lived there lived quite a lot better in a lot of ways than your average Soviet citizen.
Why was that? Was that because there was more funding given to them, or from the Communist Party? Did they kind of fulfill that picture perfect image that the Communist Party had wanted for them at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was really all part of the image. I mean, that was because that goal of creating the workers' utopia was kind of always integral to the Soviet Union ever since the Russian Revolution in 1917. That was a key part of it, and Pripyat was meant to be sort of like a signpost, saying, look, we can achieve this. We've already done it here. In this place.
And that is a theme throughout the show. That is a theme that they established, I think, early on, just the whole mentality surrounding workers, labor, just how labor affects different parties. Different parties should only be worried about their labor and not interfere with the interests of the state. Like you see that KGB operative in the bunker when they're discussing what happened, right? So kind of circling back, and the reason you have to get at that first is because the three people that the show kind of pegs as antagonists are Anatoly Dyatlov, Fomin, and then Brikhanov, and Dyatlov is like if we're talking Legasov's on the one side, Dyatlov's probably on the other side. So initially, what did you think of his portrayal and the fact that he's still alive today? He lived much longer than a lot of people anticipated.
Yeah. Obviously he's portrayed as sort of grossly negligent and in a lot of ways, I mean, and the show does accurately portray the fact that the disaster at Chernobyl was the result of a series of bad decisions related to people either cutting corners or
bad documentation or just sort of systematic dishonesty or just this sort of problems that eventually led to the disaster. I've read a couple of criticisms of Dyatlov's presentation, that he wasn't sort of that blatantly antagonistic. Right.
And
because the actor does a really, really good job.
I mean, it definitely
in hamming that up, which is why again I think we're always kind of cautious about that's an exact representation of what's going on. As good as the show is, I feel like it does take liberties in many areas. Do you think it took liberties there
with him? I mean, it's potentially. I think it's easy to want to portray the person who may have been the most immediately responsible as sort of like this sort of like angry, unlikable, bad person. I need to do more research and see what more firsthand people think to like say for sure whether that was completely wrong or not.
Yeah.
Definitely Dyatlov gets, I think, not a particularly nuanced portrayal compared to some of the other people in the show.
Yeah, it's not that I think is my key kind of thing stopping me from saying, oh, that's a direct representation. Because obviously with any history take on history, you can't say that's an absolute. You know, you can't look at any interpretation and say that's like a 100%. But I feel like of all the aspects of the show, I feel like Dyatlov was probably where they took the most liberties as far as, I mean, there's another character, obviously, by the name of Homyuk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she's fictional.
Yeah.
Meant to represent the hundreds or a good number of scientists that sacrificed and pretty much almost gave their lives in helping out with this disaster. You know, different scientists here and there that pointed out flaws. What did you think of kind of we're sort of running through the characters at first before we go into the key events, but Homyuk.
Yeah.
Did you think that was a good decision as far as?
I can understand why they did it. I mean, I think it makes sense that you want to have some sort of a point character.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to sort of portray in a miniseries whole institutions, hundreds of people working hard around the clock. It definitely is interesting to me that they didn't, I mean, with so much focus on Homyuk as sort of like the science person, the science expert that's helping them. It does make me wonder whether they could have, you know, maybe included at least references or shown that there were so many other people actively involved.
Yeah.
It also had the effect of creating a character who is like this amazing science whiz person with, you know, the brains of hundreds of scientists, because that's literally what she is.
She was everywhere. She was like, oh, she detected this in where was her Belarus or whatnot? Her supposed position was something at the Institute of Belarusian and whatnot, and then she detects the isotopes in the air off of I don't know. What do you call the machine? I'm blanking right now.
The RBMK reactor?
No, the detector.
Oh,
dosimeter.
Yeah, dosimeter.
Whatnot. There are dosimeters in the labs. Caught it as soon as the guy opened the window, and then she tested that the particles from the dust in the window or whatnot. It's just, yeah, in some ways you kind of wish that they'd have found maybe more ways to include, or better ways to include, to kind of hint at the fact that, you know, these were more people obviously that came. The evidence was kind of overwhelming, because the show does point out that you know, other countries had detected radioactive particles or isotopes in the air. The Americans had taken satellite photos. Was that really accurate, or? Yeah.
So what happened? I mean, what happened was when the accident happened, the Soviet Union very quickly tried to suppress any news of it happening,
which was their first mistake,
and keep it hidden and sort of under wraps. But the wind was sort of blowing to the north, and so the huge radioactive cloud went north over Belarus and into eventually Scandinavia. And up there, where they had nuclear facilities, they started to detect crazy amounts of radiation in the air.
It wasn't like a nominal amount. It was like big.
Yeah, a big change. And so at first they checked all of their own stuff because they thought they might have a leak. And then eventually they figured out that it was being blown out of the Soviet Union. And that got everyone's attention. Because there's a lot of radiation coming out of the Soviets. So what happened? And that is when other nations started to get involved and ask questions, and eventually, you know, zoom in and do some of their own investigation. So
like the Germans, or there was a certain nation that wasn't letting kids play outside.
Yeah, I think,
and that was kind of juxtaposed with the shot of kids playing outside in Pripyat.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is in Pripyat and in Kiev as well. Like the day after the explosion, there was set to be a big parade in Kiev.
Oh no way!
Yeah, a huge celebration. It was like a May Day celebration kind of a thing. But yeah, there was some question of whether it should be stopped, and they decided to go on with it. So you had tons of people outside, and Kiev is not far from Pripyat. It's only a bit south.
Was part of Kiev evacuated, or was it just like just Pripyat?
Yeah, just Pripyat and the towns and villages in what's called the exclusion zone, which is sort of around Chernobyl, which is still empty today. People are.
I mean, unless you go on YouTube and look at videos of these people in bandanas just going around town and.
Yeah, well, I mean, people do go there
as tours now.
Yeah, there's tours and things like that. I've never done it.
You've never been there?
No, I kind of would like to maybe at some point. But it is a thing. You can go to Pripyat. From people who've been there, I've heard there's very specific rules about where you can go and where you can't go. There are some spots where you're walking along the road and they'll, have their decimeter. They'll put on one side it crackles, put on the other side it crackles. And they're like, walk on this path and you're fine, but step off and you're going to die, kind of a thing.
The way you're making it sound is like you're suggesting that a lot of it is that fairly accurate to how radiation is over time? Like, is it active in certain areas, or are there certain surfaces that it clings to a little more?
I mean, I'm no scientist, but there are areas where there's more radioactive material, or the dirt can carry it, or things like that, or certain areas were cleared out and others weren't. So there are places you can go and places you can't. You can get close enough to see the station. But the other thing is you have to realize so the Chernobyl power plant had 4 reactors, and the 4th one exploded, reactor number 4. The other 3 kept working.
Right, and it remained in operation for some time.
It remained in operation well into, modern Ukraine existing today, because they couldn't afford to not have that electricity.
So there's so many things I want to get at, but before we dive into how did they keep that in operation despite the gnawing radiation that was coming out of Chernobyl?
Well, I mean, long term, they eventually contained the radiation with sort of what they called the sarcophagus, sort of this enormous metal and concrete construction that covered over the.
That was finished in what year? 2017, I think.
Well, they redid it in 2017 because the old one was crumbling. But the first one was built. I don't know exactly when it was completed, but. Within a couple of years after the disaster.
You have to imagine how much goes into building stuff like that. Just
a lot.
The amount of manpower and the amount of, unfortunately, deaths that occur just because people working and being exposed to.
Well, with the new one, what they did was they actually constructed it away from it, and it was
and moved it in like
it
a gate.
Over. Yeah.
Which is wild to think because it's just it. It has to be not that far from where the plant is. So for them to push it in, it's just, okay, from here, not as much radiation. Whereas to here, it's like the core, the exposed core. So, man, so many different places we can go. I'm loving that you're going off and talking about that parade, which otherwise wasn't mentioned, But there's one more key figure that was in the show that, if you're going to talk about Chernobyl, is kind of unavoidable. Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Kind of talk to us about who he is, because he's like this leader from before 2000 that people maybe don't know and remember now.
Gorbachev was the last premier of the Soviet Union.
The KGB?
No, head of the Communist Party.
Right.
So the KGB is the the sort of cabinet of interior safety, you might translate it as. Basically, they're just the secret police who monitor people, arrest people.
So in a way, they're still very much around.
The Russian FSB is sort of like the continuum. And of course, many people know that Putin was a member of the KGB. But the KGB were not the head of the Soviet government. They were just a department under it. And Gorbachev was not a KGB member. He was a party member. And he had risen through the ranks to eventually be the head of the Soviet Union. But he was an interesting guy. In a lot of ways, he wanted to try and soften sort of the hardline way that the Soviet Union had done things before. So
interesting.
A lot of people might have heard the words glasnost and perestroika, which were key policies of his. So glasnost basically lifted a lot of the free speech barriers in the Soviet Union and allowed people to more openly criticize the communist government.
Mm-hmm.
And perestroika was sort of like this idea of rebuilding and working together to sort of remodernize the Soviet economy, which was really struggling at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those things were because of Chernobyl. And Gorbachev himself has said that Chernobyl was one of the main causes, ultimately, of the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Gorbachev is often very much liked in the West because he's seen as, finally a reasonable Soviet leader.
That's what I'm gathering
about freedom and things like that. But actually in Russia, he's not so popular because he's often seen as the guy who slipped up and allowed the Soviet Union to fall apart and collapse on his watch, which is also true. His policies opened things up, but they were also at least partly part of what led to all the countries of the Eastern Bloc breaking away, the Berlin Wall coming down, and then the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a whole. And there was a coup against him where hardline communists sort of tried to take over, and in that chaos, eventually, the Soviet Union ended. He is still around. He was the leader of the Communist Party in Russia for a long time.
When you say he's still around, he's still alive today?
I'll have to double check on that. I think he might be. But I mean, he definitely didn't just disappear to the fall of the Soviet Union.
It's wild to think because it was there was a very poignant line in the show where he was saying, was it Sherbina that was saying that this is a nation that is, and I'm paraphrasing here, striving very hard not to be embarrassed. That is very determined not to be embarrassed, and that the whole mentality kind of plays into how we view Gorbachev even to today, To
some extent. I mean, definitely the Soviet Union was extremely image conscious, which makes sense given how much energy was put towards propaganda, how important the sort of ideological battle was of communism versus capitalism for them, and things like that. And it does get at, in a lot of ways, the experience of the fall of the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, there's oftentimes a big divide between sort of older and younger generations. Older generations who lived through Soviet times, and younger ones who didn't. Amongst the older generations, there are certainly plenty of people who are very much against the Soviet Union, especially more nationalist Ukrainian people. And Chernobyl actually did a lot to make a lot of Ukrainians much less trusting of the Soviet Union and of sort of rule from Moscow. Because, I mean, Ukraine was not was dependent at that time. It was not independent yet. But there are a lot of people in Ukraine and in Russia who missed the Soviet Union, who feel like it was a tragedy that it fell, and that the experience of the Soviet Union collapsing wasn't one of liberation, but it was one of humiliation, of this once strong superpower now dismantled and collapsed. We know Putin has said that he feels that way. He's been very clear that he considers the fall of the Soviet Union to be one of the greatest geopolitical disasters of recent history. And especially since after the Soviet Union fell in the 90s, that transition from communism or a Soviet sort of socialist system to a capitalist economy was really rough. During the 90s, you had just the standard of living of people just collapsing. You had, empty shelves in shops. You had people who were in the right place at the right time. A lot of them were former party members, buying up government-controlled industries at
Stocks
really cheap prices, or just taking over those industries and sort of setting themselves up as oligarchs. You had a lot of problems with sort of mafia and government, and the very large overlap between the two at the time. So someone like Putin who came to power in 2000, is seen by a lot of Russians as sort of the guy who cleaned things up and actually restored some level of
that old sense,
honor and respect and strength in Russia, and sort of brought prosperity back after the difficult years of the 90s.
Which can be taken many, many, many different ways. It's and like I said, it's impossible to discuss Chernobyl without Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was kind of that first kind of aside from the convention that Legasov had to attend, it was more like, or whatever that event was, Gorbachev was like the face of Russia that was conveying what was happening during this disaster. So, man, a lot we can go off of there, but kind of winding back to the first, let's say the first 2 episodes, right?
Okay, yeah.
I think it's good that we discussed and got at the mentality that these people had, what makes up KGB party members, or what makes up the Soviet kind of old Soviet way of thinking, was the stages of denial and doubt and misinformation that these people went through. Because I think my favorite dichotomy or thing in the show is just watching Legasov and Sherbina interact. Because you think, man, when they appear on screen together, these people are not going to get along. These people are not going to, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't kind of buddy like the show is portraying, but just the stages, various stages of denial. Did you see that as like accurate as far as people realizing what they were in for? Is because a lot of the first responders, right, who were called the fire brigade or whatnot, a good chunk of them in reality probably knew what they were in for.
No, they did not know. They had no idea what they were going into.
Because and the reason I say that or infer that is because I have talked to several people before, but you try to look up information online and it's almost like, well, it's yes and no, But in by your estimation, they really had no idea the full extent of what was going on.
No, absolutely not. The first responders who went in for the initial fire, they had no special protective gear whatsoever. They went right in. They had no idea the damage that they were receiving from radiation.
For context, for our listeners, the firefighters, I think, are kind of portrayed by a real life figure, the Ignatenkos. So Ludmila Ignatenko, who's the wife, and Vasily Ignatenko, who is the husband. Who, the Ignatenkos are the mechanism that the show follows in order to portray these kind of first responders, right? From when the explosion happens, the first time you see the explosion, it's from their point of view. It's from Ludmila. She's going to the bathroom, presumably because she's pregnant or whatnot. You see it off in the distance. He wakes up. Boom, everything gets kickstarted in motion. The music at that point is kind of like this invisible force, and I think it's one of the best aspects of the show. Where the music acts almost like it almost replaces radiation, because radiation, there's so much that we don't understand. Like it's
invisible, right?
It's an invisible force, and one of the ways that the show portrays that is a soundtrack. Just Hildor taking. I like that, if you looked up the behind the scenes, she basically went to different power plants and did like sound recordings of them.
Very interesting.
Was able to melt that into these dissonant / really intense, sharp, archaic sounds that sound like just raw power seeping through the air. I like that the show, our first glimpse of the explosion was from a commoner, because everybody else was asleep.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people thought it was like lightning or thunder, some big boom.
Right. So it happens, and then people start gathering. You can't go to sleep after a shockwave like that, right? Stuff like that. And where they're living is where, like, the living quarters of the fire brigade or whatnot, or a lot of people who worked in the same power. Ludmila, I think she worked she worked at the plant, right, as a canteen person or whatnot.
I don't remember exactly what her job was, but in the city of Pripyat, pretty much everybody who lived in that town,
one way or another,
was one way or another connected to the power plant.
Yeah, and so like just the series of events starts kickstarting from there. It's like the sense of urgency of what's going on, and the nurse in the hospital was like, "Hey, do you stock iodine pills?" And the guy's like, "What the hell? Why would we stock iodine pills?" And that still on her face of, we might be in for something bad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but yeah, just going back to the stages of denial, I just, you know, did you get anything out of that? Like, was that a real thing? Or, you know, when I say denial, like Sherbina, the moment he realizes the severity of the issue is when, at least in the show, is when the gossip tells him, you know, I think they had just gotten done with like ordering a bunch of boron sand or whatnot, or I could be wrong, but Legasov basically lays the haymaker on him and says, we will probably be dead in 5 years. And at that point, you see him just like sit down and actually process it. So even party members at that level were confused and were just misinformed on the severity of the events.
Yeah, I mean, it was a combination of things. One was, there wasn't necessarily a lot of widespread education on radiation and what it could do. And also, I mean, the Soviet Union was slow to respond adequately to protect its own image, right? It wanted to preserve this idea that they were this, technologically advanced socialist utopia that couldn't make mistakes like this. This simply couldn't happen. And with a state that relies so heavily on propaganda, even for the people who are the insiders, it can be very hard to break through that. And for people who did know the severity, but also understood the pressure of maintaining that image and that propaganda, right? There's a lot of incentive to downplay and to, and that was nothing new in the Soviet Union. That was a long, old, tried and true tradition.
I don't think it's anything unique to the Soviet Union either. We often downplay, like, this is going to date it again, but like the coronavirus, it started off as this long off distant thing that people were not concerned about.
Yeah.
And it grew and it grew and it grew. It kickstarted, like, eventually, at some point in our lives, if we make it that far, they're going to make a movie out of this. They're going to make some kind of interpretive media of what's going on.
Yeah.
And hopefully by then we'll be able to see, like, hey, exactly what's going on.
Yeah. Although with the case of Chernobyl, I mean, it does go further into this just vast web of state-sanctioned dishonesty. Right. And I mean, there's examples of things like that going even further back. Like, for instance, one of the sort of classic stories comes from Stalin's time. During the 30s, at the height of Stalin's purges, where he was having his secret police arresting and executing or sending out to gulags millions of people.
Off of nothing.
As a way to reinforce his own power through fear and terror, really. And at the same time, you had things like the Ukrainian Golodomor, the famine that killed millions and all this stuff. But at one point, Stalin called in some demographers to sort of count the Russian population. They came back, and this is kind of an apocryphal story. I'm not 100% sure how true it is, but basically they came with numbers saying that Russia's population is decreasing over time. And Stalin didn't really like that, so he had those demographers shot and a new group brought in, and they told him that the population was growing. And he was much happier with that result.
I like that you brought up Stalin and his era in the famine, because there is one instance in the show that sort of represents the older among the population that was, and you know what I'm hinting at. It's this one scene with a soldier and an old woman in a farm. Yeah, and it's just this very. I think it's one of the sadder. I mean, this show, first of all, is very much R-rated. It's very much for mature audiences, but kids can, with their parents, I believe can and should maybe watch it at some point. And there are a lot of disturbing moments in the show, very understandably so, right? Because this is one of the bigger humanity crises events that have ever taken place. And Legasov says a line that says, "You are dealing with a phenomenon that has never occurred on the planet before." And this is after Hiroshima. This is after World War II. Yeah. Just like he puts it into perspective. Like, I think the first time you get a sense of what's going on is in the first time the audience, for lack of a, this audience that maybe doesn't know the full extent of what's going on, they hear that 3.16 milliroentgen or whatever the limit was not the equivalent of 3 chest x-rays. It was more like 50. Yeah. And like, you hear the gossip says, wow, that's still a lot. You should still evacuate with that low number.
Yeah.
And then when they actually get the dosimeter, when that General Burov, or Burov, who's, I mean, there's a story surrounding him too, supposedly. Burov takes it upon himself to take the newly arrived dosimeter into the like outskirts of the power plant or whatnot, and the number comes back 16,000. Holy crap! What are we in for now? You know?
Yeah.
But circling back to the older generation being really represented, it's that one woman with the cow. She's milking the cows, and she's kind of telling her story that, you know, what happened when Stalin's boys tried to take us out? No. What happened when the famine tried to take us out? No. What happened when the war came around and our boys died and fought in the fields, and I'm milking the cows right now? No. It's just, you have to imagine how hard it is for that generation to understand this is not as bad as what you've dealt with before. This is not, I don't want to say even worse, but this is a very, very different beast. You know, how many stories have you heard like that? Because I'm pretty sure that was like a interpretive kind of way to symbolize,
I mean, it's
the challenges of evacuating people.
So that particular incident and her sort of bringing up all of the things that had happened in Ukraine, I was actually really happy to see. And so I was honestly surprised that they said the word Holodomor in like a Western, but like anything. Russia to this day denies that there ever was a Holodomor. Or that there was ever a targeted attempt to commit genocide against Ukrainians using famine. But what that was in 1932 and 33, basically the Soviets who controlled that area at that point, they essentially started to requisition grain and require larger and larger quotas of grain in production. And when people were failing to meet those, Stalin started to suspect that they were hiding it and keeping it back. It's a little bit unclear what his motives were. Some people think his goal was to sort of gut the Ukrainian nation and gut any possibility of like a nationalist Ukrainian movement. Others say that he thought that they did have extra grain and they would just bring the grain they were hiding out. But regardless, the result was that after a large, like a bumper crop harvest, all of that food was taken away and the people in the villages were left to starve, and millions upon millions of them died. Yeah. And you know, in Ukraine today, there are old grandmothers like the one who was shown there who did live through that. For these, it's called the Ukrainians call it the Holodomor.
Okay.
Sort of the death by hunger.
Right.
A lot of Ukrainians, like Ukraine has had a very hard history throughout the 20th century. Growing up, there was a woman who lived right next to us. Her name was Lyubov Petrovna. She had lost all of her siblings in World War II. Not a single one of them had made it out. And just to give you an idea of what had happened, right? So at the start of the century, you had World War I. And Ukraine at that point was divided between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was their neighbor.
Right.
So Ukrainians during World War I were forced to fight on both sides against each other.
So they were killing each other.
Yeah. Though World War I leads to eventually the Russian Revolution, so the Tsar is overthrown, but that results in the Russian Civil War when the communists were facing, or the Red Army was facing off with the White Army, which were all of the anti-Bolsheviks, whether they were Tsarist or, you know, liberal Democrats or whoever. But in Ukraine, that resulted in just years of this anarchic free-for-all war where you had the Red Army fighting the White Army, but you also had Ukrainian nationalists who were trying to declare independence between 1917 and like 1921 or 22. I want to say different parts of Ukraine declared war or declared independence 5 different times. You had Poland invading at one point. You had peasant uprisings. You had basically total anarchy for a period of years. After that, you've got the 30s, where you have Stalin's famines.
Right.
and you have his great purges,
which the world basically, like, I think of when you think Ukraine, I think a lot of people know way more about the famines than anything else, than the Russian Revolution or anything like that.
Maybe
it's so widespread.
In my experience, not a lot of people know a lot about the famines that happened to Ukraine.
That many millions of people affected and died.
Yeah.
It's just like it's an unprecedented amount of people.
Yeah. But after the famines, the 30s, you get into the 40s, and that's World War II. Ukraine was basically completely overrun by the Nazis, and the Russians, the Red Army, fighting back. Fighting with their sort of scorched earth tactics as they fell back. Devastated the countryside. The Holocaust was perpetrated on Ukrainian lands. There are a lot of sites where Jews were massacred. There were cases of Ukrainian collaborators, and a lot of sort of issues related to that. There was a Ukrainian nationalist movement that sided with the Nazis because they saw them as a chance to be free of the Soviets, and then eventually they ended up fighting against the Nazis because, surprise, the Nazis were, in a lot of ways just as bad, if not worse. And then ultimately they were sort of stuck between fighting the Nazis and fighting the Soviets at the same time before they were crushed. And then finally you get to the 50s and 60s when things sort of slowly rebuild in the 70s. And then in the 80s, right, Chernobyl, right? So there were decades of just upheaval and violence, and scars that are left to this day. Like, you go to Ukraine today, you go to any village, I don't care how small it is, there's a good chance that you'll find a monument, a World War II monument to the people who fought and died, like, right there, like in that spot. Just like the whole land is peppered with monuments to things that happened in World War II and stuff like that. So there had been, and it was cool to see that history kind of summarized sort of representationally in that the old babushka grandma in that scene.
I was just about to. Okay, yeah. So it's a babush.
Babushka is just the Russian word for a grandmother.
Or grandmother.
Yeah.
No, okay, yeah. I didn't know if it was a derogatory term because Craig Mazin,
not at all.
Craig Mazin and the interviewer sort of they went over that a little bit. But all that was sort of, you felt that. Now, most of your audience members are not going to know the extent. Are not going to really know the extent of what you just said, But I feel like the show, representational wise and visual wise, did it was a really interesting way to portray all that pain and all that just kind of, and she was a tough nut, I mean, Russians have this, I don't know if it's a stereotype or not, but it's like this tough, rough exterior because of the events that happened, right? But honest to God, I thought the soldier was going to shoot her. When you hear the shot, because you don't see it.
Yeah.
But it's just, it's so, in a way, it's almost worse that he shoots the cow, because I think in that moment, at least for me, I might be reading a little much into it, but the cow sort of represented the life that had persisted. This was a thing that provides agriculture for you, and you're shooting it. You're shooting this woman's only purpose at this point is to milk this cow and continue to provide labor for the country. And then this is what happens. I'm stripped of even this. Yeah. And it's just the fade away shot of her just in the doorway, just like with her keeled over. It was just so profoundly sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's reflective of, the thousands of people who did lose their livelihoods and were forced to leave places that they'd been for generations because of the radioactivity from Chernobyl. Again,
just to kind of give us some perspective of, what has come before, There's so many things, because if you watch the show, and we both watched it, and I listened to every single podcast they released, because they released a podcast after every subsequent episode, right? So, we're kind of brushing through a lot of things here, but there are two more. You could even get into the divers and how, the kind of liberties that the show takes, the fact that the awareness that the radiation in the waters was there, but they weren't the only ones down there. There were people, as far as the research I've done, like, there are people that had to go down there and take measurements of the water, and like just soldiers, or not soldiers, Yeah, and they weren't divers. These were 3 plant workers.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, these 3 were. I have the names right here, and I'm probably going to screw up the names. So Alexei Anenenko or whatnot.
Yeah, so Alexei Anenenko.
It's important to read the names.
Is it
Vespalov?
Bespalov?
Yeah, Valery.
That's right. Valery Bespalov. Yeah, and then is it Boris Romanov? You've got.
I think so. Yeah, Baranov or whatnot. It's just, and again, Russian is the accent I cannot replicate for the life of me. It's very hard for a lot of people to, which is why I appreciate the fact that this show doesn't shy away from these names. Even though they take liberties in the fact that they don't have a Russian accent, period. It's kind of like this Eurasian kind of British.
I mean, actually, I thought that was more genuine than if they had some ridiculous Russian accent.
I love that. And I love their explanation of it, because the Russian accent as transcribed into English, 90% of the time it lends itself to comedy.
Yeah, and also here's the thing. These in real life, these people were speaking their native language, right? Russian. Maybe in some situations, Ukrainian or Belarusian, right? Yeah. It's not like they were speaking a foreign language in an accent.
Right.
And I feel like to have them all speaking English with a Russian accent would be just silly, because these people weren't speaking a foreign language. They were speaking their own native language that
like
they
you
could
and I are to ourselves right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't if you're the sort of person who was like, oh, there's no Russian accents, really the only thing that could have been more genuine is if they were actually all speaking Russian.
Which they didn't want to do, I think, because they knew I don't know if they did, I'm just going to say I think it was a good decision for them to do so, because that leaves the actors to just act. I mean, English is, it's already a hard enough language for some people. I mean, the actor for Sherbina, I think, did a terrific job. You got Smith, who is Richard Smith's son. The actor for Dumbledore in the first 2 Harry Potter movies. Are you good?
Excuse me.
You can take a drink of water too if you like. You've been speaking a lot lately, bro. Really, round of applause for Joseph here, just laying down the history, just pedal stools or whatnot. But yeah, that was one of the aspects of the show that, again, I was cautious about. The trailers kind of suggested that, these people are speaking English, and they made a point not for them to speak in an American accent. These were all have to be like British, because it would have been, I mean, that was, you're talking about the 80s, right? That's like at the height of when the Russian versus America kind of mentality, Cold War, right off the endings of the Cold War, so to speak.
You say Chernobyl? I mean, Chernobyl is still, the explosion happened still during the Cold War. I mean, closer to the end of the Cold War, but of course the people at the time had no idea they were close to the end of the Cold War. Kind of,
yeah. Kind of like the way America is with China right now. I'd say just the relations, just really tight-lipped, very tension-building kind of relationships, right? But 2 more aspects that I want to get at. We've talked about the beginnings, different, the divers or the Ignatenkos, just seeing the ramifications of that. You can't talk about Chernobyl and not talk about the coal miners and the people that sort of had to get rid of the wildlife, which the show sheds light on, So kind of get at that a little bit, because in the follow-up podcast, Craig hinted at, they sort of said that these coal miners are really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beings within the society.
Yeah, so coal, or miners, the shakhtar, the miner in Soviet society had kind of a special position. As far as sort of the proletarian workers, they were seen as sort of the toughest, elitist, even the Communist Party didn't mess with them, kind of a group. I mean, partly because of just how brutally dangerous and difficult and
their job
and
was.
Painful their job was. Yeah. And also, more important than that, was how vital their job was to the Soviet industrial complex, right? Without them, without the coal that they would dig up, right, none of the factories would run, right? So the coal miners were in more of a position of power. They had more leverage, right, over the rest of the system than, your average worker.
Wild. That's wild, because in the show, they looked, I mean, and I've never seen any other example in as when we're talking about interpretations of history, I've never seen soldiers look outmatched in toughness than this right here. Just these coal miners, these kind of clean cut soldiers who are escorting, the scene is them escorting this guy who has the job of going to these coal miners and telling them, hey, the government has mandated that you have to come help us. And it's just these people charred in black.
Yep.
And they just look like the most terrifying bunch of people you've ever seen. And their leader, whose name I'm blanking on now, it's just like, well, if we're gonna go in, you gotta at least tell me what we're in for.
Yeah.
Because these people, they're also not stupid.
Yeah, absolutely not. These
people were, it was amazing, because our preconceived notions are that, these people who work these kind of jobs are not educated. No, was that the case for these coal miners? Were they also educated? Was everything prototypical, or were certain areas like?
I mean, well, so for one thing, the Soviet Union was actually quite a well-educated society in a lot of ways.
Sure.
They had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, still do, or the former Soviet areas. So they would have had the benefits of like that state-sponsored education, of course. But I mean, these would be working class guys, right? Like it's not like they have an advanced
Some of them
degree
probably
or anything.
didn't finish school or anything like that.
Potentially. Although by the 80s, probably a lot of them did. They got their basic high school diplomas. But I mean, these guys are working in a highly technical and very dangerous field. So, I mean, their area of expertise, their knowledge would be very deep in terms of techniques for mining, for avoiding cave-ins, for proper ventilation, all those sorts of things. So, I mean, I don't think it would be necessarily right to say that they're uneducated.
No, not at all, which is why, and the show portrays that in a very accurate way, because these workers are, not only are they educated, but they are also, like I said, terrifying. Just like these really rough and tumble men who you look at and you say, yeah, that's a guy that gets things done. And at the end of the day, they were called, so for context, these people were called into, I'm blanking on the specifics of what they were called in for. So they were called in to carve out like a tunnel.
They needed to dig out an area so that they could install a heat exchanger to stop the core from melting down into the groundwater, which basically means they needed to dig down space to put a giant refrigerator under the building, more or less.
Because this was the result of the boron and the lava that had occurred at that point, which is still there, by the way, right? I think the core and like the uranium that a lot of that material is still there. That they could never retrieve it. That's why they covered it. That's the best you could do. You can't approach that stuff. You're dead. Yeah. If you do. I mean, there's so many aspects we could say to that too. Is the fact that they had this machine that the Germans had sent in or whatnot. This was from West Germany too. Another example of how the country didn't want to be embarrassed. But just the layering. I think that the show had just the fact that they gave them the propaganda number instead of what the actual number was. So what resulted was a machine that after 5 seconds was fizzled out because of the radiation, And so all that as a backdrop, you have these coal miners going in. They're hot. They're really hot, working in these horrible conditions. And it's just like, and even they are like saying, this is really hot. And so what do? They strip naked.
Actually, as far as
the show represents,
that didn't happen.
Okay. I was about to ask, like, okay, Joe, like, so why do you think the show portrayed them that way?
I mean, it's HBO. They need to have some naked people.
Oh, do you really think it was? So is that where the sellout kind of begins? Is they had to have some kind of nudity?
I mean, I don't know.
Male nudity.
It is actually
full frontal, by the way. You can see it.
Oh yeah. I mean, there is kind
parents maybe shield your eyes there, but
an interesting story there. In that they were largely safe from the radiation as long as they were underground.
Right.
And they didn't. I mean, they spent a lot of time under there,
But a lot of people still.
But a lot of them got fatal doses of radiation, not because of the work, but because they would take smoking breaks outside of the tunnel.
Gotcha.
They would be irradiated when they were out there.
So a lot of them, but these are coal miners, so of their own volition, that's like their break time. It's like their place of rest or whatnot, and the whole reason they were there was based off of a 60% calculation that it would melt through.
I mean, they didn't know for certain whether or not it would, but I mean, 50-50 or,
that's a chance.
Is this going to ruin the groundwater of the entire country? 50-50? Like, that's a tough bet to make, right?
And as it turns out, it still hasn't.
No, it didn't.
Right? It didn't.
Yeah.
Man, and to give lives away, it's just a theme, and that's another theme of the show is sacrifice. When they were pitching these, going back to the divers, they were, Sherbina gave this kind of, the reasoning Sherbina gave, you'll do it because your country needs you. You'll do it because it must be done. Was that very in line with what the Soviet mentality was, the workers' union?
Oh, yeah.
The Labor Party.
I mean, so we're dealing with a culture that's very collective in a lot of ways. And also, I mean, a culture that is, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of used to suffering and capable of suffering. I mean, you look, for instance, at World War II. I'm going back to this, but the Soviets suffered more casualties by far than anyone else in that war. And so much of the way that soldiers were encouraged to fight was, yes, you're gonna die, make it count. So this idea of sacrifice was, very much part of it. And there is a very dark side to that, and that is that oftentimes often very much so, the Soviet government was extremely callous towards the lives of its people. I mean, obviously, throwing people to their deaths at war is one thing, but we also have, the gulags, right? And the arrests and the executions that went along with that. So, from a propaganda area, right, there's a lot of, sort of this martyrdom rhetoric and, sacrifice for your country and, give up your life so the rest of us. But that, while there's all this propaganda that pushes that forward, the upper echelons of the Soviet Party were always far more willing to send Russians and Ukrainians and others to their deaths rather than sacrifice themselves.
Yeah. It's just but these people, for lack of a better term, they went.
They did.
They did, and a lot of them got the job done. Well, the last sort of aspect as we maybe start to wrap things up here is the events of the last episode, them just kind of getting at the hints, getting at the root sort of as much as they can of the problem. So we know now that a lot of it had to do with the flawed designs of the RBMK reactor itself. Just the fact that a lot of documentation was withheld. And what did you think of the representation of how that convention went down?
It definitely is.
The trials went down.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most fictionalized parts of it.
That's what I'm gathering.
Yeah. Which, makes sense because it would be hard.
You've got to explain to your audience how it happened somehow.
Yeah, right? And it's, I have to give it to them, it would be very hard to essentially give, it's what's basically a lecture on, what happened. Now, for me as a history teacher and a history buff, I would be all around for, sitting down for a lecture on Chernobyl, but general audiences might be a little bit harder to convince there. So they use that courtroom setting essentially to lay out the details of how exactly the
kind of like exposition reveal and whatnot, but in a creative way, because at that point, if you watch up to episode 5, you've gotten all of the kind of physical aspects of what has the tangible kind of visceral physical things that have happened to these people up until that point. It gives it in context, because a lot of what I can only imagine if this was in other showrunners' hands. Not to say the show was perfect. It did have its flaws, but a lot of other people would put that at the beginning and
Maybe,
sort of
yeah.
have like a time lapse jump.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this, if you're just talking about history, it's better just to give us to layer it like that. You know what you're saying.
Yeah,
First
and also
episodes.
I think one of the interesting ways that they made it interesting too is they built up the, you know, how did it explode as sort of like the big mystery, right? The central question that they had been asking for so long. And so when they present, you know, their information as the big reveal, that is far more engaging for an audience.
Right. Because as a storyteller, I mean, this is why I wanted to have you on, just because you can kind of see between the filmmaking. But for me, the filmmaking is the first thing I see. And just kind of the layering effect of, okay, how do you tell a story like this with so many moving components? So by that 5th episode, the reason I think that court, although they take liberties, the reason it's effective is because emotionally, people are already kind of sort of hooked, and not hooked. I hate to say that because it is a real event, but emotionally, you get what's going on.
Yeah,
you've seen the faces
invested.
of, you've heard the screams of Vasily as he's dealing with the spores or whatnot growing off of his face. You've seen Toptanov, the young 25-year-old who was a graduate. He was a really, I mean, can you imagine it? Being 25 and working as at that point in time, he was appointed like a really, really high position at the power plant. It's just, it's unthinkable. Akimov, whatnot, who according to the records on hand, his face was so charred off that they didn't even want to put him in the make-him chair for it.
Yeah.
You know, you saw Vasily Ignatenko's face just really unrecognizable. The makeup department. Now, I think they also took liberties there as well, right? Because I looked up several interviews of nurses who had worked during that time, and the faces weren't nearly that deformed, but still, I feel like the show did well in illustrating at which point. So even like there's a shot of the dogs and cats and all the domestic animals in a truck just going into this landfill. And if you're a pet owner, I'd gather that might be the most painful part of the show, is either the guy shooting these puppies or
definitely it's very grim watching. And
the name of the episode, they base it off of this poster. I wanted to get at this a little bit. It says, "For the goodness of all mankind."
Yeah, right. So our goal or purpose is the happiness of all mankind.
The happiness of all mankind. Was that a real thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Was that a real? What was that? Do you know what that was a part of?
I mean, that would be sort of like a fairly typical sort of like propaganda slogan or banner. You had, I mean, sort of in everyday life in the Soviet Union. At workplaces and schools, you know, you just have a lot of sort of like the very sort of like upbeat, like, we're all in this together and this is awesome kind of images and slogans out there for that sort of like to encourage.
Pretty much like capitalist America. You have companies that come out with their slogans, and I it's just, using that as a backdrop, which is why, you know, where we are in episode 5. Which is why we feel the way we feel when we see the trials happen, you know. It's just part of the norm for storytelling. I think with historic storytelling, you have to be very specific, and I find that they did the best that they could.
I think in a lot of ways they did.
Yeah, it's like to give us, because we know what happened. You know, you have the ability to read and look it up, but what these people have to deliver on, which I think they did, was the again, I've used this word a lot today, but like mentality, the mindset of what these people were going through,
the experience of it. And also I think it definitely, they bring this story to, people who maybe wouldn't read about it, right? Or don't know about it. And I think, I mean, from my experience, there's this, to me at least, a surprising number of people here in America who like had no idea at all what Chernobyl was or that it had even happened. So this is kind of bringing this story to them for the first time.
Yeah. And kind of narrowing in the spotlight on Legasov or whatnot. The reason, at least to me, as a, you know, I'm not as knowledgeable in history as maybe others are, but Legasov, and just doing the research on him, it's like this guy, there's this line in the scene where they say, well, you got all that information off of a description of a rock. You know, he's representative of a lot of scientists that probably knew what they were hearing as soon as they read the report. You know, and to that, do you think that was accurate as far as the portrayal of that, like just scientists being able to, the scientific community identifying and moving in on an otherwise very hard to penetrate system?
I mean, they did. I don't know as much about the science side of it, to be honest, but I mean, you did eventually see sort of the Soviet system pushing into high gear to actually deal with a really huge problem. It took a long time. It took longer than it should have, but they did eventually get there. And that was largely, or partly at least, right through the pushing and the insistence of a lot of the scientists who were sort of taking the measurements and coming to the conclusions that this was really a serious problem.
We talked earlier about how the show kind of made Homyuk the representation of all these scientists, but I did like this one instance where and how that was flawed, but I did like this one instance where she was calling someone at a different office or whatnot. I think it was in Russia or Moscow or whatnot. Yeah. And they were using cryptic language to talk about how they were using boron and sand. Like, the forest is usually so hot. Little Boris, who's 6, and some, the atomic numbers and the elements. Was that true? Was that how they communicated?
I don't know about that, but it would have been a safe assumption on both of their cases that their phones were bugged and that the KGB was listening.
That's a prevalent theme throughout the show.
Yeah.
Like you see these long off shots of the kind of, you can kind of tell what the intentions are, whether the camera's still or a little bobbing side to side. And there are lots of shots where I noticed, I don't know if you did, but like shots of Legasov from a distance where it looks like someone's looking at them, or like overhead shots when he's in the hotel, and he's walking to the bar. You see the camera kind of follow him from above, or sometimes you see shots of Sherbina or Legasov with phones in the background, just to kind of hint at people. This is still the KGB we're talking about. Yeah. And I thought one of the more interesting parts of the show was when Legasov was at the bar. I'd rather have this glass that's like tipped down. Superstitious, the 2 that supposed spies that were sent to follow him around. And then he says, and then they ask, hey, do we have anything to worry about? And he says no. He chooses to lie.
Yeah.
I gather a lot of scientists are put in that like really hard situation, right? A lot of scientists were put in that hard scenario.
I mean, even as they were cooperating, there was a lot of pressure to only reveal the information that was state sanctioned.
Right.
And I mean, there could be consequences.
To not cause panic.
And ultimately, when Legasov did push past that and say more, there were consequences for him. One of the inaccuracies of the show is that like he had this big moment in court when he like let it all out. What really happened was sort of in the months afterwards, he wrote snippets and published more. And spoke at different gatherings, right? And he ended up essentially still being disgraced and sort of pushed out. Eventually, he did record his account in tape. Then he did commit suicide. But rather than it being sort of like one big defiant moment, right, it was months of work of him trying to bring people awareness about the issues behind Chernobyl and eventually getting shut down.
I don't think that takes away from his actions at all, though. Or a scientist like him.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
That helped to solve and absolve the problem.
Yeah,
So
I think it's more just a difference. They decided to portray that, sort of to get it out there probably in a more clear way, like right there in the courtroom.
So to kind of wrap things up, like what can be gathered from watching stuff like this? Because it's at a time, especially at a time like this, at the time of recording this, we are still going through the coronavirus. We're going through some political upheaval as we speak. What can be gleaned from taking part in history? Because it's always, we always say that you should study your history to not repeat, so that history doesn't repeat itself. But to people out there who are contemplating this show or contemplating things like this show, what do you suggest? What do you suggest as people trying to study history is what I'm asking.
Well, I mean, we often say, study history or else, you're doomed to repeat it. Although sometimes I'm tempted to say instead, study history, it'll repeat itself, and then you'll be taken along for the ride anyways.
Yeah.
But there definitely are some interesting sort of things that are relevant to today. I mean, obviously, for one, Chernobyl is another example of a disaster that was, primarily scientific and then compounded by the social elements surrounding it.
Right.
It was a situation where you had scientific experts struggling to gain the cooperation of civic leaders, a situation where the truth of the situation was contested, and where the sort of political leaders involved had incentive or cause to minimize or distort the actual nature of the disaster, and the fact that those decisions they made led directly to deaths. I think there's a lot of parallels to be made towards, the coronavirus today, primarily a scientific problem that has led to a lot of the same issues of, experts and experts struggling to have the trust of the public and of people in power, and of just so many different narratives around what is actually happening and the severity of it, and the fact that there are, people dying and real consequences.
Right. Yeah, and again, it's the key reason I wanted to talk about it, even after, 30 years after the events happened, or at this point, we're coming up on 40 years, which is crazy to think about. Just like as a backside, it is a rather difficult watch, I'd say, for especially right now, because people are experiencing similar crises, right? We're taken out of our comfort zone. We're taken out of a certain, not to be all philosophical or not, but it's the reality of human nature. It's like, the phrase that keeps circulating around is, when are we going to get back to normal? Well, my thing to that is, was it ever normal to begin with? Was it ever well, the things we took for granted, was that normal? All that. But yeah, that's Chernobyl. I think the both of us, I speak for me, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that.
Age limit, I'd maybe cut it off at about 14 or 15. I don't feel anybody below that should maybe.
And certainly it's pretty harrowing.
Yeah. A
lot of tension.
If you do decide to watch it with kids or whatnot, or younger audience, you may have to have a sit down and talk down, like, hey, this is what's going on. But it would be fairly responsible, I think, to show history as portrayed, because even a lot of adults still don't know that it happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Joseph, you just did 1 hour and 30.
Oh, really?
You are a natural, man. You're complete. You a year ago you were like, I don't know how I would be, and look at you, man. You're a complete natural at this. You should consider doing it more.
That was fun.
Joseph, any final thoughts before we wrap up? Is there anything you'd like to say to the public, or is I don't usually know how to wrap these up, because it's usually sports takes. Yeah. This is usually where I say, hey man, so what do you think's gonna happen next? But as we're going through what we're going through right now, do you have any kind of final wrapping words?
I guess to conclude, it's worthwhile to take the time to understand the stories and history that come from other places, to see the parallels and the differences between other times and other places and your own. And if a miniseries can be an effective tool to assist you in that endeavor, then by all means, use it. I would say for sure, if your intention is to seriously learn more about Chernobyl using the miniseries, you could definitely watch it, listen to the podcast where the creators, and one thing I really appreciate is we're very open about what they changed, what they didn't, and what their research was. Look into some books. There's a good one called Voices of Chernobyl, which is a collection of oral history. Absolutely, though, it can be a great entry point to a deeper understanding of this critical period of history.
Yeah. Well, guys, that's been Crunchy Take, a very, very special episode of Crunchy Take. Yeah, and that's it. Joseph, thanks for coming on, my man.
Hey, it was great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, folks, that's a wrap on the Crunchy Take for today. See you guys.
До свидания.